It begins not with a war, nor with a great king's decree, but with silence. The kind of silence that fills the spaces we do not talk about. A silence that lived in castles, in cottages, behind market stalls, and beneath monasteries. It lived in the shadows of history, unnoticed but ever present. It is the silence of human need, the unspoken, unavoidable, and universal reality. Where did people go? In the Middle Ages, when nature called. History remembers the swords, the thrones, the prayers, and the plague. But it rarely remembers the garderobes, the cesspits, and the chamber pots. This is not a story of battlefields or royal feasts. This is a story of where those warriors and kings, those monks and milkmaids, went when their stomachs turned and their bodies reminded them they were human. Tonight, we begin in the forgotten corners of the medieval world, not in the throne room, but in the room behind it, not with a crown, but with a hole in a wooden bench. Imagine, for a moment, the cold stone walls of a 12th century castle. Torches sputter and crackle along the hallways. You walk past tapestries of saints and battles, past iron-bound doors and spiral staircases. You come to a narrow passageway tucked behind a heavy wooden door. This is not a grand chamber. It's a small alcove, dimly lit and strangely quiet. In its center, a slab of stone with a circular hole cut into it. Beneath that hole, darkness. This is the medieval toilet, the garderobe. The word itself has layers. Garderobe, from the French, to guard the robes. In some castles, clothes were hung above these toilet shafts, not because it was convenient, but because it was believed the strong ammonia rising from the waste would kill fleas in fabric. In that sense, the toilet was more than a place of relief. It was part of their hygiene system. Crude? Yes, but clever for its time. Waste from these high castle garderobes often fell straight down into the moat. In some more advanced castles, there were chutes angled to carry waste outside the walls. A few even had primitive forms of flushing, a flow of water redirected beneath the seat to carry things away. But these were exceptions. Most waste collected in cesspits, deep, dark, and foul-smelling. When full, these pits had to be emptied by hand, by someone. Enter the gong farmer, a man whose job was as unpleasant as it sounds. Dressed in thick leather, face wrapped in cloth, he descended into the pits with buckets and shovels. His task was to dig through the filth of towns and castles, remove it, and cart it away. Sometimes by river, sometimes by cart, always for pay, and always with shame. These workers, often outcasts, lived on the edges of society. Not just physically, but socially, their work was vital, but vile. They were feared for their smell and pitied for their work, and yet they kept the cities from drowning in their own waste. Outside the castles, the story was no cleaner. In medieval towns, the toilet situation was both more public and more chaotic. Streets were narrow and packed with wooden houses. There were no sewers as we know them. Some towns had open drains, little channels in the center of the road where people poured wastewater and refuse. Chamber pots, simple bowls kept under the bed, were emptied into these drains, often with a shout of warning. Sometimes, not. There are stories of passers-by being doused in filth from above. It was part of city life. You learned to walk close to the walls, not in the middle of the street. You kept your hood up, and you listened for that warning cry. Gardez-vous, a garbled version of the French, meaning watch the water, except it wasn't water. But not all toilets were open holes or flying pots. In monasteries, for example, some effort was made toward dignity and structure. Monks lived by routine, prayer, work, rest, and yes, bathroom visits. Large monasteries had what were called reredoors, a kind of communal toilet block built over running water. These were long stone benches with multiple holes, often without partitions. Privacy was not part of the design, nor was silence. Some monasteries even had specific rules for bathroom behavior. Talking was discouraged, staring was forbidden, but the smell, that was unavoidable. Even the monasteries, with their aqueducts and planning, struggled in times of heavy use or flooding. Waste backed up, diseases spread, and the line between holy ground and human mess blurred. Back in the countryside, peasants had even fewer options. A simple hole dug behind the house, a small wooden seat over a ditch. Sometimes, nothing at all but the edge of the forest. In winter, the ground froze. In summer, the flies came. Yet for them, this was life. Toilets were not luxuries. They were tasks like chopping wood or hauling water. Children were trained early, not in etiquette, but in balance, to squat without falling, to empty the pot without spilling, to run to the ditch and back before the dog found the trail. In many households, dried moss, straw, or even sheep's wool was used in place of toilet paper. In richer homes, cloth scraps might be saved for this purpose. In poorer villages, leaves did the job until winter, when options froze with the ground. And in all of this, something strange persisted: silence. People lived their lives surrounded by waste and stench, but they rarely spoke of it. There were no manuals, few written instructions. It was a part of life so familiar, it became invisible. And yet, it shaped cities, it influenced architecture, it decided health and disease, birth and death, because when the waste piled too high, so did the risk. In the tight, unwashed alleys of medieval towns, disease spread quickly. The Black Death, carried by fleas but accelerated by filth, tore through populations. People who lived knee-deep in waste had no idea how vulnerable they were. They blamed sin, stars, strangers. They prayed, they bled. But they did not clean. And so the story of toilets becomes the story of survival. For all their ignorance of germs, medieval people understood one thing clearly: smell mattered. They may not have known why the stink of a cesspit made people sick, but they feared it. They respected it. They built systems to hide it. Pipes of clay, privies over streams, public latrines with flowing water. Crude, but an attempt, a beginning. Tonight, we are not laughing at the past. We are listening to a world that found ways to survive without what we take for granted. To a world where toilets were carved into cliffs and emptied by moonlight. Where dignity was improvised and comfort was earned. Where a man with a bucket did more for the health of a city than a knight in shining armor. The silence of toilets in history is not accidental. It is cultural, practical, emotional. But in that silence lies a story worth telling. Not of kings, but of dung. Not of conquest, but of containment. And in that story, we see something human. Something honest. Because to be human, no matter the time or title, is to face the same truth. When nature calls, even history must answer, and so we begin. The sun rises over a medieval town, not with peace, but with noise. The clang of iron against stone, the clatter of hooves on cobbled streets, the distant calls of vendors. Beneath that surface, however, something else stirs, unseen, but always present, a slow trickle in the gutters, a faint, sour scent in the morning air. Before the people rise for market, the waste of yesterday lingers underfoot. This is not the countryside, where a family can dig a pit and call it done. This is the crowded heart of medieval life, the city. Here, people live shoulder to shoulder. Wood and thatch buildings lean over narrow lanes. Water is drawn from wells. Meals are cooked over shared fires. And when nature calls, the answer is often shared as well. There were public latrines in some cities. In Paris, in London, in Bruges, officials tried to organize spaces where townsfolk could relieve themselves with some order. These public facilities were sometimes simple benches set over pits or platforms above running water, but they were few and not free. For most, the solution was personal. The chamber pot. It sat beneath the bed or beside the fire, a small ceramic or metal bowl. At night, when it was too dangerous or too cold to go outside, the pot was used. In the morning, it had to be emptied. Where it went depended on where you lived. and how much you cared. Some poured it into nearby ditches, others into open sewers that ran like muddy veins through the town. In some homes, it was simply tossed out the window. With or without warning, a well-known shout would echo through the alleyways. Garde-loup, a word meant to warn, perhaps, derived from the French garde des l'eau, beware of the water. If you were lucky, you heard it in time. If not, your day began with more than a rude awakening. City officials tried to regulate waste disposal. They were laws, sometimes strict ones. In 14th century London, for example, there were fines for dumping human waste into public streets. Offenders could be imprisoned, their names posted, their homes searched. But the truth was, enforcement was difficult. There were too many people, too little space, and too few options, and so the cities smelled. Not always, not everywhere, but enough to be remembered. Travelers from distant lands often wrote about the stench. Foreign scholars described the filth in terms that were almost poetic in their disgust. And yet, to those who lived there, it was normal. It was part of the background, like smoke or rain. Something unpleasant, but expected. Beneath the surface, some cities began to dig, not for treasure, but for relief. The first covered drains appeared. Stone channels beneath the streets, guiding waste away from homes and markets. These systems were crude, easily clogged, and often overwhelmed in heavy rain, but they represented something new, a recognition that civilization could not grow on top of its own refuse. Some cities built privy towers, tall structures attached to the sides of buildings, with waste chutes that dropped into courtyards or enclosed pits. These were common in multi-story dwellings where families lived stacked upon each other. The higher your floor, the longer the drop. Over time, cesspits became more organized, dug deeper, lined with stone, and covered to trap the smell. But even the best cesspit was only a delay. Eventually, it had to be emptied, and that meant hiring someone. The gong farmer, still present, still vital, still working by night. When the city slept and the air was cool enough to carry the stench away, these men often worked in teams. One would lower himself into the pit with a bucket. Another would haul it up and pour it into barrels. A third might wheel the load to the edge of town, where it would be dumped or sold. Sold in rural areas and farming communities. Human waste was valuable. It was called night soil. Mixed with straw and composted over time, it became fertilizer. Poor in nitrogen, but rich in phosphates, and used carefully. Some farmers paid for it, others collected their own. What cities saw as filth, the countryside saw as resource, but transporting waste was dangerous work. Not just because of the smell or the weight, but because of the health risks, infections, parasites, and sometimes, the pits themselves were the danger. There are records of men drowning in cesspits, slipping on ladders, overcome by fumes, or caught in collapses. One story tells of a nobleman who fell into his own castle's latrine and drowned, a grim and undignified end, but not unique. These accidents were rare, but not surprising. Medieval people understood that their waste was dangerous, even if they didn't know why. They feared the smell, not just for its offense, but for its power. They believed in bad air, miasma, as the cause of disease. Foul smells were signs of sickness, and in a way, they were right. Even without modern science, their instincts told them to avoid the stench, to cover it, to bury it, to build around it. And build they did. Slowly, unevenly, and imperfectly. In wealthier homes, especially those of merchants and lesser nobility, indoor toilets became more common. A simple bench over a shaft, a pot emptied by servants, a closet tucked away behind thick walls. These were not places of luxury, but of privacy, a new idea in sanitation. Architecture began to adapt. Homes were designed with small rooms called prives. Drainage chutes were hidden inside walls. Waste was directed into pits or canals, and while the smell never vanished, it was managed. In time, this shift reached the public. City councils invested in infrastructure. Tax money was used to dig larger drains, to enforce waste removal laws, to build latrines near markets and taverns. It was a slow process, often delayed by war, famine, or corruption. But it happened, and through it all, the toilet, a simple, crude, unspoken, remains central. Not in poetry, not in paintings, but in daily life. It shaped where people walked, where they lived, how they viewed their neighbors. It shaped the rhythm of morning chores and midnight trips. It decided who lived on the top floor and who emptied the pots below. Tonight, as we wander these streets of stone and wood, we see a truth often left out of the textbooks. That civilization is not only built on philosophy and power, it is also built on what it hides, on the systems it buries, on the waste it learns to manage. A city is not great because of its towers. It is great because its people could live together without drowning in themselves. In the dark corners of medieval life, the toilet was the quiet engine of health, dignity, and change. It never stood in the spotlight, but it held the structure together. And so, we follow its story. Deeper still. Not all waste fell into ditches. Not all chamber pots were dumped from windows. Beyond the crowded cities and the smoky huts of peasants stood a different world, a world of stone fortresses, thick tapestries, and quiet corridors. Here, behind castle walls, the story of the medieval toilet took on a new form, not because the needs were different, but because the solutions were. Inside the great halls of medieval castles, life moved with measured grace. Servants shuffled silently, nobles dined by candlelight, guards watched from towers. But even in these grand spaces, nature called, and when it did, it called with the same urgency it did for farmers and merchants. So what did a nobleman do? He used the garderobe, built directly into the thick stone walls of castles. Garderobes were small stone chambers, narrow, cool, and often dark. A simple seat was carved into the stone with a round hole in the center. The waste dropped down a vertical shaft, usually falling into a cesspit or moat far below. The air, heavy with dampness, rarely moved, and though the walls of the castle were strong, they did little to stop the smell. But for the noble, privacy mattered more than comfort. The garderobe offered solitude, a small space away from the public eye. Unlike the communal privates of monasteries or the open ditches of the town, the castle toilet allowed a moment alone, even if the experience was far from pleasant. Some castles had multiple garderobes, cleverly built into towers or placed over running streams. In royal palaces, the garderobes were occasionally decorated with wooden doors, stone benches, and even shelves for cloth or herbs. The wealthy tried to mask the unpleasantness with fragrance. Bundles of lavender, dried rosemary, or small pots of vinegar placed nearby to fight the air. Still, no amount of herbs could erase the reality of medieval plumbing. Servants were responsible for cleaning these toilets. Buckets were lowered into the pits below, and carts hauled the waste outside the castle walls. The work was constant and dirty, yet it was done, often without thanks, by people whose names never entered the records. In grander estates, nobles sometimes avoided fixed toilets altogether. Instead, they used close stools, wooden boxes with lids, lined with a chamber pot inside. These were mobile, and often carried by servants. A noblewoman might use one in her room, while a nobleman could have his brought beside his bed. The contents were cleaned by hand, emptied into a pit, and scrubbed for reuse. There was nothing elegant about the process, but for the upper class, convenience was more important than sanitation. In some courts, especially later in the Middle Ages, a new position emerged, the groom of the stool. This was a courtier assigned to assist the king with his toilet needs. It was not a lowly job. On the contrary, it was one of high trust and intimacy. The groom had the king's ear in his most private moments and often became a powerful figure behind the scenes. That is the strange paradox of medieval sanitation. The further up the social ladder you climbed, the more private your toilet, the more honored the person who helped you use it. but the less practical the setup became. Royal toilets might be built in beautiful towers, far from any water, difficult to clean, and hard to access. Peasants, with nothing but a pit, sometimes had more efficiency than kings. The castle, for all its strength, could not escape the problems of waste. In winter, the chutes froze. In summer, the smell thickened. When the cesspits filled, the air grew foul. Flies gathered. Illness followed. And yet, solutions came slowly. Some castles experimented with ventilation shafts, narrow tubes carved into the walls to draw out air. Others created sloped floors that could be flushed with buckets of water. In rare cases, natural springs were redirected beneath garderobes to create a primitive flow. But these were rare luxuries. For most, waste piled up until someone was ordered to remove it. Still, the nobility clung to their rituals. After using the toilet, they wiped with cloths, often discarded or washed. Some used moss. A few used wool. The idea of cleanliness was more spiritual than scientific. Washing was for sins, not for sanitation. Bathing, too, was infrequent. The toilet was only one part of a larger picture, where the body was considered troublesome, mysterious, and in need of control more than care. Hygiene was not absent. It simply lived under different rules. A noble might perfume themselves daily, change linens, and burn incense, all without once washing their hands. They might build a latrine with carved wood, gold hinges, and velvet cushions, but rely on servants to touch anything unpleasant. They valued privacy, but not plumbing. And in this, we see something telling. Toilets, in the medieval world, reflected power. Who cleaned them, who built them, who had one indoors, who used a ditch. These details were not just about comfort, they were about class. The poor squatted by the river, the rich sat in towers, yet both had to solve the same problem behind castle walls. The solutions were more elaborate, more secret, and more strange. But they were still solutions, and they remind us that no matter how fine the robe, how sharp the sword, or how high the tower, every person faced the same quiet moment of need. And in that moment, stone and status mattered less than convenience. So the garderobe became a symbol, not just of medieval engineering, but of medieval life. Quiet, simple, and hidden away, necessary, unspoken, and always just a little bit uncomfortable. That is where we leave the nobles, perched above the moat, balancing tradition with necessity. And now we turn to another world entirely, a world where sanitation and spirit walk side by side. Far from the castles and the cluttered towns, another kind of life unfolded. It moved with quiet rhythm, measured, intentional, surrounded by stone walls and guided by bells. It was a life of prayer, silence, and structure. This was the monastic world, the cloisters, abbeys, and convents of medieval Europe. Here, men and women withdrew from the chaos of ordinary life, seeking purity, discipline, and closeness to the divine. But even here, where voices whispered and thoughts turned heavenward, the body remained grounded. Monks and nuns, just like kings and peasants, faced the same physical needs, and though their minds were on eternity, their feet still touched the earth. Sanitation in monasteries was never accidental. It was planned, unlike most of medieval society, where toilets were afterthoughts or nuisances. Religious communities often placed them at the heart of their design, not out of luxury, but out of necessity. Hundreds of people lived, ate, worked, and prayed together, day after day, year after year. Waste could not be ignored, it had to be managed. The solution was the reredorer, a long, narrow structure, usually built behind the dormitory. The name came from Latin roots, rerum meaning things, and dorter from dormitory. It was the place behind where monks slept, a place to take care of the things left unsaid. A reredorer looked simple from the outside. A row of stone or wooden seats, built over a running stream or drainage trench. But it was a marvel of monastic planning. Water, channeled from nearby rivers or springs, flowed beneath the latrine, washing away waste at regular intervals. Not perfectly, but better than most medieval systems. The air still carried a smell. The seats were still cold, but it was functional, quiet, clean. By comparison, there was no privacy. Just a long bench with evenly spaced holes, sometimes without partitions. A monk might sit beside his brother in silence. Both focused not on conversation, but on discipline. Silence was often required, even here. Talking was discouraged. Laughing was rare. The body was not something to be celebrated. It was to be tolerated, controlled to the outside world. This may seem uncomfortable, but for the monks, it was just another part of the rule, the strict set of guidelines that governed every moment of their day. From the moment they woke to the last prayer before sleep, everything was structured. Even the toilet. Some monasteries had set times for using the rerid order. Early morning before prayers, late at night before rest. In large abbeys, dozens of men might file in, one after the other, robes brushing stone, sandals tapping the cold floor. They said nothing. They looked at no one. And when they were done, they left quietly. Cleanliness was part of spiritual discipline. Monks bathed more often than most laypeople. They washed their hands regularly. They cleaned their tools. They laundered their habits, the long, woolen robes they wore each day. And they maintained the rerid order with routine. Buckets of water were poured. Lime was scattered to reduce odor. Chutes were cleared. The stream redirected if needed. And yet, this effort was not born from modern ideas of germs or hygiene. It came from order, from respect for the rhythm of the monastery. Everything had its place, including waste. Women in convents followed similar patterns. Their facilities were simpler, often smaller, but carried the same intention. Some convents had rerid orders, others used movable chamber pots. What mattered was not the luxury of the design, but the discipline behind it. There are records of nuns assigned to clean these spaces as part of their weekly duties. They scrubbed with vinegar and ash. They aired out cloths. They checked the flow of water. For them, it was not shameful work. It was service to the community, to God, to the rules that shaped their lives. Outside the walls of these sanctuaries, sanitation was chaos, but within, it was calm, managed, ritualized. Even the placement of the toilet mattered. In some monasteries, the latrines were built at the end of a long, covered walkway, far enough from the chapel, but close enough to reach in cold weather. Stone gutters carried water beneath the floor. Vents were carved high in the walls to let air circulate. Doors creaked quietly. The wine did the rest. There is beauty in that simplicity. A kind of grace in the way the monks accepted the body without glorifying it. They did not fear their needs, but they also did not dwell on them. They handled them, then returned to prayer. In that sense, the rerid order was more than a latrine. It was a symbol, a reminder that even in places of silence and study, humanity remained. That no one, no matter how devoted, could escape the basic functions of life. But they could meet them with discipline, with dignity. It is easy to romanticize the medieval monastery, the stone arches, the gardens, the chants in the cold morning light. But the reality was physical: hard floors, cold water, heavy robes, and a simple toilet shared by all. There are no paintings of the rerid order. No stained glass windows showing monks at their daily task. But its presence is as important as the altar, because it made the monastery livable, bearable, clean. And perhaps, in a quiet way, holy, because to serve the body, humbly, simply, and without shame, is to recognize its place in the sacred order, not as something to ignore, but as something to manage, with care, with balance, with understanding. The medieval monastery teaches us that even the most spiritual lives need space for earthly needs. That order can be found in the messiest corners, and that cleanliness, when paired with purpose, becomes a kind of prayer. So as we leave these quiet walls, we do so with respect, not just for the silence of the monks, but for their systems, for the way they brought structure to chaos, and in doing so, gave even the humblest toilet a place in the story of civilization. The story of the medieval toilet does not end in castles or cloisters. It continues, quietly, beneath our feet. Beneath every stone street that was paved, beneath every wall that was raised. Beneath the weight of history itself, sanitation, for much of human existence, was reactive. Waste came, and it had to go somewhere. In the Middle Ages, that meant pits and pots, moats and ditches. But as cities grew and people lived closer together, the consequences of poor waste management grew louder. Smells, disease, death, civilization, if it hoped to survive, had to respond. The shift was not sudden. No single invention swept away the medieval world and replaced it with plumbing. But the clues of change were there, building slowly. In the 14th century, as the Black Death swept across Europe, killing millions, people began to notice patterns. Where the filth was thickest, the deaths were highest. Where the air was foul, sickness followed. They did not yet know about bacteria or viruses, but they understood that the world they built had consequences, and so they began to plan differently. Some cities invested in deeper cesspits, more regularly emptied. Others dug early sewers, stone-lined tunnels that carried waste outside the town walls. In London, a major trench known as the Great Drain was built to carry filth into the Thames. In Paris, similar systems developed along the Seine. It was not modern plumbing, but it was a first step. The idea of waste as something to manage, not just avoid, took root. By the 15th century, architectural manuals began to include suggestions for latrine placement. Builders learned to include drainage channels in their designs. Wealthy homes had servants, specifically assigned to manage chamber pots and privy maintenance. These jobs, once entirely invisible, became part of structured domestic service. Cesspit cleaning even became a regulated profession in some towns. Men were licensed, paid, and scheduled. Waste was recorded, collected, and moved. And all the while, culture began to shift. Literature from the later Middle Ages includes quiet references to toilets, not in detail, but in recognition. Writers no longer ignored them. In religious texts, metaphors of cleansing the body and soul appeared side by side. Artists, especially in the margins of manuscripts, sketched tiny drawings of figures using toilets, often with a mix of humor and honesty. It was a whisper of what had always been, human, messy, and necessary. As printing spread and education grew, ideas about cleanliness evolved. Books began to speak not only of purity of spirit, but of purity of space. Clean homes, clean clothes, clean bodies. This changing mindset laid the foundation for the modern world. In the centuries that followed, science caught up with instinct. Microscopes revealed what the eye could not: germs, contamination, waterborne disease. Suddenly, what medieval people had only feared, modern minds could prove. But before the science, there was survival. And that survival depended on every crude solution the Middle Ages had managed to invent. The garderobe, perched over the moat. The chamber pot beside the fire. The reredorer above a running stream. These were not perfect systems. They were compromises. But they kept the world moving. Toilets, in their strange silence, shaped the medieval world more than we admit. They determined where buildings stood, how cities grew, who worked, and who served. They influenced health, class, architecture, and even war. During sieges, defending a castle often depended on keeping the garderobes functional. A blocked chute or contaminated pit could spread illness faster than arrows. There are records of attackers setting fire to privy towers, trying to collapse the waste shaft and force surrender from within. Toilets were not simply side notes. They were, quite literally, central infrastructure, and yet they were rarely honored. No monuments were built for the man who dug the cesspit. No hymns were sung for the woman who scrubbed the privy floor. But without them, the cathedrals would have crumbled under their own weight. Today, we flush and forget. But the system beneath our feet is built on centuries of trial and error. Each pipe and valve is a descendant of a stone chute in the Norman Tower. Each sewer line owes a debt to the monks, who channeled a stream beneath the REREDO or TER. And each moment of comfort in the modern world, clean bathrooms, flowing water, safe waste removal, is a silent echo of those who lived without it. They endured, they adapted, they solved the same problems we solve now, only with fewer tools and greater patience. So as this story ends, it ends not with a king or a crusade, but with a quiet recognition that history is not only made by the swords that conquered or the prayers that rose. It is made in the quiet corners, in the things no one wanted to write down, in the moments no one wanted to describe. In a stone seat behind a castle wall, in a pot beneath a straw bed, in the cold walk before dawn to the edge of a village ditch. History lives there, and now. As you rest, eyes closed, mind still, you carry with you a story most would overlook. A story of how people lived, and how they coped. A story of what they hid, and what they built anyway, because in the end, the medieval toilet is not just a curiosity, it is a mirror, a reminder that even the most advanced societies begin by managing what no one wants to talk about, and that real progress, lasting, human progress, is often measured by how well we handle the parts of life no one sees. So sleep now, with that strange, forgotten history beneath you, not boring at all. Just quietly true.